Welcome everyone to the sixth and final part of our look at the 1918-1919 flu pandemic. We are using Extra Histories series, which is fantastic, on the pandemic to be our discussion starter. You guys have been sharing some incredible stuff this week as we have talked about this. Everything from a background about what was going on in your country if you live in places that aren't being talked about, to the very personal stories about members of your own family. And I love that stuff. Just as I share my stories from my family, I love hearing yours. So please keep those coming as always. And as has become our new practice, I invite you to leave a comment at the end of watching this video and tell me something you learned you didn't know before, or share something with all of us that could add to our knowledge of this pandemic and what happened during the history of it. Please, if you like what you see, hit that like button, and I encourage you to check out the original content creator as well. They do usually, after a series like this, do what's called a lies episode, where they go back and cover some of what they got wrong. And listen, I recognize this because I've done it many times myself. There are times, when I'm doing these videos like this, all of this is off the top of my head. Unless I stop in the middle of the video and do some research, which I usually tell you as I'm doing it, I don't go and look into these events beforehand. So I'm just reacting from what I already know. So occasionally my memory's wrong and I get something wrong. And usually within a couple hours, several of you have pointed that out, and I'll usually correct that on the next video, but also put a pinned comment on the existing video to let you guys know that. So same thing with Extra History. There are going to be things that even when we do research, sometimes the research we do gives us wrong information. And so it's awesome that they go back and cover that. I don't do reactions to that stuff just because I feel like there wouldn't be a lot for me to add. But I definitely encourage you with any of these series from Extra History that I do to check out their lies video just to get that further information. I'll go watch it on my own after this video today, but I won't be reacting to it. Heading to France in 3 days. So there's going to be a lot of World War I content coming your way. And probably tomorrow, maybe the next day at the latest, I will be posting a video as kind of our final preview of what you can expect for that. Before we get started, I do want to give a quick shout out. Sorry, I had to pause for a second there. I want to give a big shout out to Owen Freed, who is our newest executive producer level patron. Thank you so much, Owen. And he also reached out to me and we had a chance to talk, and I'm grateful for your support as well as the support of everyone who is a patron or a member. And all of you who watch these videos, leave a comment, hit that like button. Those of you who subscribed, I'm grateful for this incredible community we have here, and I hope that you're as excited as I am to be a part of it. Here we go, let's dive in.
Rio de Janeiro, 1919. This year, Carnival is different. The flu that had killed 15,000 in Rio is gone, but its spirit lingers. Float crews adopt macabre themes taken from the height of the outbreak. There's the Block of the Holy House, playing off a popular euphemism for the hospital. Behind them parades the Block of the Midnight Tea, named after a rumor that doctors killed terminal flu patients with opium overdoses.
Wow.
Streetcars pass, decorated with teapots and cemetery gates. A few months before, the same streetcars had collected the city's dead.
Now, to some of us that might seem a little weird, a little dark, but, we have to remember that every culture is different. And in their culture, this was a way for them to deal with this, to process it. And you remember, this is the Spanish culture has, and I don't understand much about it, so I don't want to step too far outside of what I know, what I'm talking about. But I know that, for example, there's the Day of the Dead, which is something where you kind of commemorate and stuff. So not every culture looks at death the same way. Not every religious background looks at death the same way. So I definitely don't want to get in a place where I judge how they choose to deal with it. And in fact, in some ways, I really kind of respect and admire that it's something that they are just recognizing, hey, this is a part of who we are now. This is a part of what we have all collectively gone through together.
The third wave of the pandemic kept killing until 1920, but it was clear that the worst was over. Humans had done little to stop the virus. Instead, it simply ran out of fuel. Those who caught it became immune, and it spread across the globe so fast, infecting so many people, that herd immunity began to protect those who escaped previous waves. But there were still flare-ups. On November 11th, 1918, the news broke. An armistice. The Great War was over.
So the armistice, and this is something I'll talk about more in France, it gets signed a little after 5 a.m. on November 11th. The Germans wanted it to take effect immediately. And I say Germans because the other Central Powers had already dropped out of the war by this point. The Ottomans and the Austro-Hungarians had signed their own separate peace deals, and so it's really just pretty much the Germans as far as major powers go. They wanted it to take effect immediately. The Allies didn't, and the Allies actually, even after signing the armistice, launched attacks. And there were something like 3,000 people who died between the time the armistice was signed and the time it took effect 6 hours later, which is really super sad, especially for that last American soldier who's probably the last guy who died in the war. His name was Henry Gunther. We're going to tell his story. Died at 10:59 as German soldiers were waving at him to not charge at them because they didn't want to kill him. They knew it was about to be over. It's very, very sad.
People flooded the streets, ignoring bans on public gatherings. And in each city, a new wave of infections followed the impromptu celebrations. The same would happen again and again on a smaller scale, as loved ones gathered to welcome returning soldiers home. There were still outbreaks, still deaths, but everyone could see it was trailing off. The horror was past. All that remained was to count the cost, a project that continues to this day. In the years after the pandemic, researchers initially estimated the disease had killed 20 million people. Modern estimates have increased that number to 50 million.
And just like with the plague in the, especially in the 1400s, it's not simply a matter of the deaths, but it's everything that happens with the deaths. And you can see that happening today, not so much because of the number of people who have died, but just because of the impact to the global economy. Even as deaths have declined in most of the world, there's still a lot of deaths happening. I don't want to discount that. The effect on the economy, I think, is always going to be seen. And there are some things in our world that are never going to be the same as they were before this current pandemic. We've changed a lot of how we do things, and I don't think some of that will ever go back to how it used to be. You can't underestimate the impact that the death of 50 million people had on the world in terms of the economy, in terms of families, in terms of people who had to deal with the aftermath of those things.
Though because statistics aren't available in the worst hit regions, like India and Russia,
Right.
The final number may be twice as many. According to modern estimates, it killed 17 to 20 million in India, perhaps 4 million in Indonesia, possibly 1 million in Russia, 400,000 in France, and 390,000 in Japan. In the United Kingdom, it sickened a quarter of the population and killed up to 220,000. In the US, it took around 675,000, more than the Civil War, and killed 16,000 in Philadelphia alone.
And to put that in perspective, the U.S. population, I think, was probably about a third of what it is now. And that death toll is not much less than what we've had in the current pandemic. So significant impact.
But for a disease that killed so many, it's hard to point out direct consequences. In fact, the flu seems to have worked in tandem with the war, each magnifying the effects of the other.
Yep.
In the 1920s, a wave of political unrest swept countries around the globe. This was because of the war, but also because the flu had revealed deep inequalities, especially in colonial rule.
Yeah, we can't, it's sometimes hard to separate how much of what happened in the 1920s is because of the war, how much is because of the pandemic. Because first of all, the war and the pandemic are intertwined, and so they're hand in hand, and so really you can't separate them. And so you have to just say that whatever happened in the 1920s happened because of both of those things. I mean, this was the 1910s, especially 1914 to 1920, because we have to remember that even though World War I ended with the armistice, at least the fighting ended, the war didn't officially end until the following year in 1919 with the Treaty of Versailles. That was not the end of major fighting that was happening in some of these places. There's still fighting going on, for example, civil war in Russia. There's still fighting going on in Europe in places. A lot of places continued to see fighting into 1919, 1920, 1921.
Post-viral fatigue from flu infections probably contributed to the depression and listlessness that took hold after the war. Yet, despite the heavy toll the flu took, and the heroism of medical workers that died fighting it, there's still no monument commemorating the event, other than plaques marking mass graves. Textbooks mention it, but usually just in passing. We chose not to remember, which is why some have christened it the Forgotten Plague. There are theories why society chose to forget the flu. Perhaps it came and went so fast that people simply remembered it as part of the war.
Yeah.
Or it's possible that focus on the war and inability to see the big picture meant that society never really absorbed what happened.
Yeah, I think it's the war. I think people were so caught up in remembering that event that they just didn't have the capacity or ability or desire to also remember what happened on the home front with the plague. Even into 1921, you've got, for example, here in the U.S. and in France and the U.K. for that matter, you've got the tombs of the unknown soldiers or unknown warriors being commemorated. And so people are still remembering the Great War, but not so much the plague of flu.
But keep in mind, it also hit a generation that was just more used to epidemics, in a time where mass death may have been less shocking. Conversely, some have argued that the flu was so traumatic, families formed unspoken agreements never to discuss it. The memories that did endure were intensely personal. Lost parents, lost siblings, friends gone too soon, families impoverished when their breadwinners died. In some cases, soldiers came back from the trenches to find their entire family wiped out. Ask your family, and you might find a story of your own.
And that's why I love that you guys have been sharing those stories. And some of you, maybe you don't know the stories. I get a lot of comments from people saying, oh man, this guy, because I'm always talking about my family connections to different events in history. And I say this every time I try to reply to those. Listen, my family doesn't have any more connections to the events of history than anybody else's. I just happen to know my family's stories because I've spent 30 years researching those stories. You have those stories too. You just may not know them. So if you're lucky enough to still have older folks in your families, grandparents, things like that, great aunts and uncles, talk to them. Ask them stories about what the family... Obviously, nobody who is old enough to remember these events, for the most part, is alive anymore, but they may have had parents who talked about it. Ask around. Find out those stories in your family.
Generations later, the trauma still lingers. Yet apart from Catherine Ann Porter's Pale Horse, Pale Rider, there was no explosion of novels about flu, as there were about the war. It was a more difficult subject, its faceless enemy more challenging to portray than the man-made terror of the trenches. But Porter wasn't the only notable person to suffer from the flu. In fact, it infected so many famous people that it raises a chilling question. How different would our world be if even one of them had died?
And not just the famous people, but... think about the people who were not famous, who died, about the children they might have had, about the things they may have done later in life. The what ifs are endless.
Among the ill were President Wilson, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, Gandhi, Kaiser Wilhelm, and General Pershing. A generation of notable artists caught it as well, including T.S. Eliot and a young ambulance driver named Walt Disney. Franklin Roosevelt contracted it while sailing on USS Leviathan. Then there are the people we did lose. The president-elect of Brazil and Austrian painters Egon Schiele and Gustav Klimt.
And we know what happens with Austrian painters, just saying.
Lenin's right-hand man succumbed, clearing the way for his replacement, Joseph Stalin. And in New York, the flu killed an obscure German immigrant, allowing his son to cash in his life insurance and expand the family's real estate business.
Trump's grandfather.
His name was Frederick Trump. You might be familiar with his grandson.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. In some part, or in large part, really, Donald Trump's fortune today can be traced back to the flu pandemic. His grandfather was an immigrant from Germany, dies in the flu pandemic. The life insurance from his death gets cashed in, and it helps start the family's real estate empire.
But the flu also drove scientific discovery. Doctors developed new surgical techniques and procedures for disease containment. It likely sped up the civilian world's adoption of ambulances. The desperate vaccines produced during the pandemic, cocktails of antibodies from every bacteria doctors suspected, were the predecessor of today's combination vaccines.
See, so again, like I said earlier about the parallels, there are certain things that even maybe not directly related to the pandemic that forever change because of the pandemic. And these are examples of some of those things. Things that get developed that you take for granted that grew out of necessity. Necessity is the mother of invention. When you have to do things differently in order to deal with an evolving situation, and you realize that different is better, you never go back to the way things were. Telehealth is an example of that. A lot of people now can do telehealth, where you can get on a video call and you don't have to leave your house to go see a doctor. A lot of people who work from home will probably never go back to not working from home because we developed new ways of doing things. Having meetings through Zoom without having to fly across the country. And some companies may realize, hey, we can do it this way and save a lot of money in the process. A lot of things are never going to be the same.
Like diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis. Nurses, who bore so much of the burden, won new confidence and respect for their profession. Increasingly, their discipline became more than serving as doctors' assistants, and the flu helped them be seen as professionals in their own right. Many cities and nations, caught off guard by the crisis, established new health departments and organizations to monitor disease.
So I stopped to look it up because when I saw the CDC thing pop up, I thought, I don't think the CDC goes back that far. It was actually started in 1946. Now, it may be they're just showing the CDC logo because they want us to understand that the organizations they're talking about that nations set up in the aftermath of the pandemic are like that, in which case I get that. But this was not one of the organizations that was set up in the aftermath of the flu pandemic.
It helped push the idea of national health insurance and government-provided medicine. And it drove research. By the 1930s, researchers were crafting effective flu vaccines. And many who battled flu would go on to do great things. Anna Williams nurtured an entire generation of female researchers. FDR eulogized Welch via radio. And remember Oswald Avery, the guy Welch tasked with finding Pfeiffer's bacillus and who helped develop the pneumonia serum? After the war, he returned to researching bacteria, trying to discern how a bacteria without a hard coating transformed into a bacteria with one. After laboring for 20 years, he finally found the substance that caused the change: DNA. That's right. Avery discovered that the purpose of DNA is to carry genetic instructions. Today, he's considered a pioneer of modern genetics. The flu also drove research into Pfeiffer's bacillus, which many still believed caused flu. After working in a military hospital during the war, one Scottish doctor devoted his life to studying microbes. One day, he accidentally left a culture of it out for the night. When he returned the next morning, he found a strange mold growing on it that killed any bacteria it touched. That man was Alexander Fleming. And the mysterious mold? It was penicillin, the first wonder drug and probably the most consequential discovery of the 20th century.
Absolutely. I mean, there are so many things that have happened throughout history that would have been easily cured by a little penicillin. And this, when people are asking me, and many of you were asking me what changed so much from World War I to World War II when it came to the drop in deaths from disease, and even the change in the number of people who survived wounds, there you go. It's things like penicillin, just the simple ability to defeat an infection. You know, the reason they had to amputate so many limbs during the Civil War in the United States is because they had to prevent infections that could be easily cured by penicillin.
Even today, the 1918 flu remains a subject of study for researchers. In fact, over the last several decades, researchers and epidemiologists have started to make breakthroughs on the 1918 flu, helping us better understand what happened so we can combat the next great pandemic. Researchers still don't know where the flu emerged, There are way more theories than we portrayed, but we can now name the culprit. In 1998, researchers obtained a lung sample from a frozen grave in Alaska and confirmed what many suspected. The 1918 flu was H1N1,
Avian flu.
an avian strain.
Yep.
New then, but is less dangerous now that our immune systems have had a century of exposure. They've also begun to unravel the pandemic's mysteries. For instance, we now suspect that it killed young, healthy people precisely because they were young and healthy.
Yep.
Those patients that turned blue, they probably weren't killed by the flu at all, but by their own immune systems. Once infected, victims' immune systems triggered a massive inflammatory response known as a cytokine storm. But instead of neutralizing the flu, this enormous release of disease-killing cytokines filled the lung sacs with fluid and inflamed them so much they couldn't absorb oxygen. But the greatest lesson of the flu pandemic is that flu can't be ignored. We don't shrug off new flu strains anymore. In fact, many health organizations monitor both human and animal strains, predicting the dominant variety each season and creating vaccine ahead of time.
So this is a great example of learning from the past. Now they keep an eye on this stuff. Places like the CDC, that's their job. Before the last couple of years when we started hearing about them all the time, they were the ones who were always watching and keeping an eye on things. And when something broke out that had never been seen before, they would go and monitor and they would investigate and learn about it and try to predict. It's so much like predicting earthquakes and predicting volcanoes and all these sorts of things. It's the job that they have, is to try and learn, watch what happens over time, and then try to project outcomes. Are they right all the time? No, because science is a learning process, and there's no place that you arrive and okay, now we know everything. And we never will know everything.
If a new strain does arrive, we'll be much more prepared than doctors were in 1918. We have electron microscopes, antivirals, vaccine labs, and tested containment plans. But a vaccine would still take months to produce, meaning we'd start by using the same measures they did a century ago. Voluntary quarantine, banning public gatherings, staggering...
Not Hamilton! No, not Hamilton! I like that, though. That's really cool.
...work hours. In fact, as Rob researched these episodes, the city where he lives, Hong Kong, closed schools to prevent a seasonal flu outbreak and killed birds that tested positive for avian influenza. A century later, the battle against the 1918 flu and its offspring continues. So seriously, get your flu shot.
So I believe that this was made before the current pandemic. Yeah, 2018. So, I mean, everything they said there was not at all influenced by what we're currently experiencing. That was a good 2 years before we really got hit by everything that our world has become today. So, interesting stuff. And I want to say once again, thank you guys so much for keeping it civil on the comment section. I know that there's a lot of strong emotions about anything that's current, and we all have, very strong feelings about what's going on in our world today and how to deal with it or not deal with it, and personal things versus what the government's role is. And I encourage you to have those discussions. We need to have those debates. I just don't want to have them here. And I appreciate you guys honoring that. So thank you so much for that. Please make sure you have your notifications turned on so that when I do upload in the weeks ahead, you will not miss any of those things. Hit that like button and let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as we discussed at the beginning. Thanks for watching.